here. That's oh, sorry, what that was. Yeah, we've published RUX6. The next sites are these three smaller ones, RUX1, 2, and 3, followed by US at the bottom of the picture. And I'm talking about that in some detail, I hope. And also the Udal North, the largest site dug by Ian Crawford. These sites took a total of 33 years to excavate. And I just wanted to show the relationship of each other. And it wasn't always straightforward right from the very beginning of his excavations. Now, this is one of David's sites showing you the relationship of the sites to each other. The RUX6, the one we've published, is in the bottom right-hand corner. And I think the slides are very important to me because they show how the landscape has changed. There's quite a bit of coastal erosion. Some of that, where RUX6 is concerned, was due to the excavation of that area. And the sites RUX1 to 3 really aren't visible, but I'm assuming they are in that area. This is the cover of RUX6, which David kindly introduced to you. It's still available by looking on the ArchaePress website. You can download it as an internet publication, and it gives some of the background to what Ian Crawford hoped to do in this massive project. I think we were very lucky to get RUX6 written up. And we were lucky because Ian Crawford had actually, on the insistence of what was Historic Scotland, written a sort of narrative account. Now, it's the only one of these sites where he actually did that. So we had a good basis for turning his narrative into a book and into an area where we could actually get specialist analysis. The cat has wandered in and is looking at me. Sorry, just removing him out of the picture there. Yes. So we did specialist analysis. There was some already. We updated everything and we published it. And I'm really pleased, really, for the Crawford family that we managed to get that site actually written up. Now, I'm going to briefly have a look at the smaller sites, RUX1, RUX2, and RUX3. RUX1 was the largest of these small sites, and it was the only site where I've been able to find that he actually used some form of written documentation on the stratigraphy. I think it was started by his first wife, Harriet Crawford, and it was something he didn't actually ever continue with, which was a great pity, because had we had that information consistently for all the other sites, it would be easier to write them up and have had them published. RUX1 produced animal bone, pottery, quartz, pumice artifacts, but I think it was largely unstratified, and I will show you that in a moment. RUX2, the one nearest the coast on the left-hand side, had a stone enclosure, but that was of unknown date, and there was very little artifactual or environmental evidence. RUX3, the one in the middle, had a wall, a stone wall, and it had an occupation layer in what was otherwise blown sand. And the most interesting thing about this was it also had beaker pottery. and we can actually work with that material across these 3 sites and actually bring those to publication, because they're very small, they're concise, and the stratigraphy, whatever it is not complicated. So this was the beginning of Ian Crawford's investigation into the area. Now, I think this is RUX, and you would have seen a little bit of this being excavated in the BBC clip that was shown. You can't see very many structural items. There's a little bit of wall running behind the man in black. Otherwise, it looks to me to be a lot of blown sand. You can see also the depth of the sand. The accumulation of it is a constant theme running right across the Udal project area. You can possibly also see lines of darker material, buried turf layers, but that's about it for that site. This is another view of it, probably a few years later. He seemed not to excavate one site at a time, but jotted about between sites, possibly pursuing his thoughts or various themes that he was interested in. Now, the interesting thing to me here is that this site was being excavated before he realized that there was a site on the coast immediately behind the man stood up at the back of the excavated area. And that is the RUX6, the one we have subsequently published. And at the time he was digging these smaller sites, he did not know that was there. Now, there's not a huge amount of artifactual material. As I've already mentioned, there's nothing virtually from RUX2. RUX1 has what I imagine is late Neolithic Bronze Age pottery. You can see the carbonized food remains on it. Those are the black deposits. The other 2 photographs, the one in the bottom left-hand corner is probably Beaker period, that's very early Bronze Age. And the RUX3 picture could be late Neolithic. And that has still got to be looked at. But it's quite possible for these 3 small sites to be investigated, to be written up as best we can from the evidence that we have, and actually published them as probably quite a small paper. Some specialist work has been done, but not everything. I'm going to now look at the Udal South in the bottom part of the screen. This is the 2nd largest mound in the project area and on the Udal Peninsula. Yeah. This is one of David's photographs. You can see that, or possibly just out there are 2 large circular buildings in the lighter green part of the mound, and beyond the person in the middle is another circular structure. So these are 3 wheel houses, and you can obviously they've survived well. They're built of stone, and what Crawford did was remove the sand from the top of the mound. This is what he found out. Now, this is a sketch from one of the annual reports of his interpretation of wheelhouses. You have a large one in the middle with an annex, a smaller one immediately to its right, and towards the southwest of the image, there is another wheelhouse. Now, the interesting thing is that Ian Crawford found the Udal by reading about a possible souterrain discovered by Erskine Beveridge in the beginning of the 20th century. The souterrain is an underground passage, and this is what Erskine Beveridge located. Now, I was never entirely sure where this was, but if you can see, the larger of the wheelhouses has the same shape projected from its wall outwards and possibly down slope. Now, it's bothered me really that I don't think Ian Crawford ever really bothered with this souterrain. He's made a note of it, he's put it on a plan, but that's about all he did. These are called wheelhouses because you have these pillars of stone in the middle of the circular building, which look like the spokes of a wheel. And each building had a single entrance, and they're all pointing to the south, southeast. And as I say, the larger one in the middle has at least one annex and a bulge in the wall opposite. So, which to me is very Iron Age, sort of like defensive entrance type, but we really don't know at the moment. This is more Ian Crawford's more detailed examination of, well, it's really a sketch again from the annual reports, notating really the main structural items of two of these buildings. And if you can clearly see in the larger one, there is the word half, though it's written vertically on this image. They did have halves, and this was something Ian Crawford was never particularly happy about. He later denied that they did have halves at all. Now, just to tell you a little bit about the archives of this excavation, it's mostly plans and sections. We don't have a written account. We don't have any stratigraphically organized context sheets. We have no context sheets. We have, in our modern terminology, we don't have a matrix of how things were interpreted. We have nothing written down about it apart from what's in the annual reports, and that's very scanty. He had notebooks, he used notebooks, but his writing is completely illegible, and the notes are intelligible. We've had various people have looked at them, and nothing can be made of them. They are just notes like a stream of consciousness, sometimes about the weather, often enough about the surveying of the site, but not about the stratigraphy. I think sometimes Ian Crawford liked detail, but he forgot about widening the picture to get a better understanding of what went on. And to me, I worry about why he didn't re-examine the souterrain. Did he disbelieve it? Did he not think Erskine Beveridge was right in what he himself found? I don't know, but it's a complete mystery to me. But a few photographs here of the excavations of the Udal South. I've put them in to show how he excavated. I can't necessarily at this stage identify which wheelhouses these belong to. And you can see at the top of the picture a wooden and metal bogie on rails that Ian Crawford bought from the National Coal Board, I think it was, and he used this bogie, set out the rails going downhill, and the excavators filled the bogie with sand, and then the sand was dumped outside the excavated area. What else was I going to tell you about this? Yes, now we have quite a few images, slides and black and white prints from the Udal South. We have just about 400 images, of each, both slides and prints. Although that might seem a lot, it isn't, because many of them are in very poor condition. And you will see as we progress through this talk, you might question, well, why is that image that colour? It's because Ian Crawford's photography was either underexposed, overexposed. He had problems with getting the films processed, and there's been a lot of deterioration over time. I just want to point out one other thing about this slide. If you look to the far left, you can see a guy there with bare feet. A lot of the excavation of these sites was done without excavators wearing shoes, and this was to preserve the delicate sand layers that Ian Crawford was interested in. The previous image was 1966. By 1979, this is 13 years later, he's still excavating on the Udal South. I think this is the southernmost wheelhouse, but I'm not entirely sure. To me, the excavation looks a little bit more controlled. There was some specialist analysis of the finds and samples, especially that of animal bones. And we know from these sites that there were young cattle buried in the ground, in the floors of these buildings, as a sort of ritual before whatever activities took place in the buildings happened. So that's 1979. By another 10 years later, this is how I think the largest of the wheelhouses was left, and that's probably more or less the picture today. It struck me, though, that Ian may never have got very far with these buildings. He left them standing, he excavated the floors, but we don't actually know whether there was anything else beneath. And the last image I have of the excavation, and again, I think this is the southernmost wheelhouse, he used sort of conveyor rollers and presumably boxes or buckets of sand that were pushed along and then dumped over the edge to remove sand off the excavation. We have a good series of plans. We've got, as I've mentioned, some good or reasonable images of this site. So I think it's possible to make sense of what happened here. Whether we will be successful in matching artifacts and samples to the various houses is another matter, but I think we have a reasonable chance of getting a good story out about what these structures were about, their dates, what they were used for. It would have been better if we'd had in Crawford's thoughts, but I'm afraid we don't have that, and it is a great loss. These were clearly domestic buildings. Ian Crawford, who you can see at the back of the picture there, bending over by the ranging rod, he clearly dismissed the domestic elements, and he considered them some form of temples in the last piece of published work that he managed before he became ill. So there's a lot to think about and consider with these sites. And just before we move on to the next one, just to show you this, really, this is an excellent overhead view of the sites. You can clearly see the annex of the large wheelhouse just to the immediate left of the picture, and the walls of the other two are somewhat there. And you can see that the whole area has been protected about the last 10 years, I imagine, with a fence. And that's brilliant because it has kept the animals out, cattle especially, cause a certain amount of damage to this area. And just to show you 3 finds from the Udal South, rather a good survival of a considerable part of a cordoned and decorated large vessel, blackened by sooting or food remains. A fretwork comb, I can't remember whether this is antler or bone, and it's an amazing example. I've not actually seen another one like that. And in the bottom right, it's a quartz pebble painted with not soot but other black sticky substances that have survived on it. These quartz painted pebbles suggest a Middle Iron Age date as the pottery and the comb. So we're happy that we know where we are with this site. It's limited in extent, and as I say, I think we can actually do something with it. Now, turning to the Udal North here, the large purple site in the bottom of the picture, and David's current view of it. It almost looks like a volcano that's had its top removed, and the excavated area has never been grassed over. It's been well, since it was excavated, and certainly since the mid-1990s. This is as a close-up view of the site. I have no idea what those rings, almost rings of stone, are in the bottom. I assume they're archaeological, but I don't know. And just to show you the bogey on wheels, this is how it was intended to be used. And I presume it came to the bottom end of the main picture and tipped out onto a lower area of the mound. I think all in all, Ian Crawford and the excavators removed about a 5-meter depth of sand from across the whole area. And yeah, it was quite a phenomenal achievement. Now, if I think the records that survive, or the archive that survives of the Udal South, are moderate to okay, to me the records that we have for the Udal North are poor. And I'll explain that as we go through the next lot of slides. Now, the only records we have, the only written records we have of what Ian Crawford found and excavated and interpreted are his interim reports, which are more or less summaries. They don't give us any great detail. They sometimes match up the odd find with a certain structure, but on occasions that's rare. He wrote an article called Sandscaping and Radiocarbon Dating in 1977 in Antiquity. That's an archaeological journal. And he privately published in 1986 a booklet, and that was titled The West Highlands and Islands, A View of 50 Centuries, the Udal North US Evidence. And that is about all he'd ever written on the site. So I went back through the interim reports, and this is one of the earliest sketches, which gives us something to think about. As I say, it's from the annual reports, and it shows some of the latest structures on the site. And I've highlighted what I can work out from the sketch and from what he wrote in that year of the annual reports. Now, Ian Crawford was a historian as well as an archaeologist, and he did an awful lot of research into the early records of the Udal area in the National Records of Scotland, and he tried to identify these buildings with those of Taxman's house that was supposed to have been in this area. And I think he was quite happy knowing that, or thinking that, the documents he had studied and the structures he was excavating actually married together. And I think he got into problems the further he dug, because he was then out of his comfort zone. He had no documentary evidence to support anything after 1400 or whatever it was. So this image tells me a lot. It tells me he was confident about the two structures at the bottom of the image. The middle bit's very shaky, and the top part of the structure where there is a Norse building, that only came to light later when he realized what it was. But I don't, as I say, think he was particularly happy about this complicated area and of the number of buildings he was finding. To look through the slides, and I've managed to cobble two together, and I think this is the early black house that he found. And you know, this is remarkable. These are two decent images, and we come to worse ones in a moment, this being one of them. Now, this is the Norse building, and I've been looking at this over the last few days, and I realized something, that in Crawford, I think, used the Wheeler method of excavation, which was to lay out your site in squares and dig in squares. And I think that's what he did here. But of course, the buildings weren't aligned with his survey, and so the squares and the building didn't match up, and therefore he dug part of the building as one square and then realized that the other bits of it were elsewhere. And it's a bit of a mess. It's probably the most important building on the whole of the Udal Peninsula, and certainly of the Udal North. And to be honest, I think this is the only decent photograph we have of it. I haven't, to my knowledge, seen a photograph, seen a plan of it, but that doesn't mean to say they don't exist. It's just I don't remember having seen one of it. But what I can deduce, it's similar in size to the late Norse farmhouse excavated by Neil Sharples at Bornish in South Uist, and that was in the 1990s. And it's very similar to the 12th century longhouse at Kilfedra, also in South Uist, dug by Mike Parker Pearson in the late 1990s. Now, Ian Crawford was working on this site the late 60s and early 70s. He could have had a tremendous amount of what's the word I'm looking for, advertising, kudos, amazing research potential. If he'd only realized what he was doing and actually wrote up more about this structure. I call it thunder. His thunder about this site was overtaken by these other professional researchers and archaeologists. And yeah, he lost his thunder. He could have put the Udal on the archaeological map in the 1970s. The other interesting thing about this particular site is that in comparison to those others dug in South Uist, this is very impoverished. It did not, as far as I'm aware, have a good range of artifacts and samples as the other sites did. So which bothers me, that I don't know why we didn't have more information, unless that information is there, it just hasn't been teased out at the moment. The other thing that bothers me is that we're all very interested about the earliest Viking occupation and whether there was evidence of that on this mound. So I did a little bit more research and whilst putting this presentation together, and I came across a little bit of extra information that Ian Crawford thought there were a number of turf structures probably beneath this building and on other parts of the mound, and that he associated with ploughed fields. And he thought these buildings, in which he thought there were 3 of them, there were some outbuildings, possibly enclosures, and he considered them Viking. They had pottery, what I would call bake stones or platters, and I do know that there is a comb case and for an ampler comb, and I don't know where it's from, but it could be from wherever these supposedly turf structures were. I have not been able to find any images of these turf structures. So on this slide, I've highlighted where I think the Viking buildings would have been on the northeast part of the mound. It's frustrating, it's unsettling that there's been a lot of archaeology, a lot of archaeological buildings and features that we know very little about today. And the research potential, I would say, is probably quite limited. We'll get something, but it would not be what we would expect. Now, I've also highlighted other things on this image because we're going to go forward in time a little bit. Back in time a little bit. We're going to go back to the Iron Age to look at some Pictish figure of 8 buildings in a few moments. And the image on the top left is part of a palisade. You can see the post holes for round timbers. I believe it was associated with the Pictish buildings and some sort of cremation platforms. I know nothing further about them really. And the 2 areas in the middle highlighted with the red arrows are probably what Ian Crawford called field systems, and the photograph at the bottom is of plough marks belonging to these fields, and there are probably middens there as well. So it's interesting. Now, a nice sketch of some very nice cellular buildings, these late Pictish, Pictish or late Iron Age structures. They had little enclosures. I don't know how you can see the lines of small stones forming shapes to one side of buildings. Each building had a rectangular hearth, and the photographic image on the screen is of one of these buildings with a hearth in the centre. I'm not entirely sure what artifactual evidence goes with these, but we do have, hopefully, some pottery. We do have some ample working, and that's all I know about at the moment. Moving on to the next slide. Now, this is a difficult sketch that Ian Crawford produced. The dark image is what Ian Crawford termed a fort, a stone fort, and you can see the picture below the dark outline in the plan. We have plough marks, we have other enclosures, small stone walls. We have on the left-hand side of the image a stone platform. We're not entirely sure what these were. Ian Crawford was quite imaginative. He called the right-hand photograph, the structure there, a fort, and the stone platforms he considered to be part of a cremation complex. I'm not sure whether that's correct. I really don't know. But also in the image in the centre is what is considered to be a corn drying kiln. So there's a lot going on, but whether we'll ever understand that or not, I'm not entirely sure. Just before I move on to the next image, you can see that one of the photographs is blue, and that is, I don't know, overexposure, poor calibration of the camera, poor processing, but it's typical of what went on at the Udal North in particular. Now I'm showing you two images, neither of which are particularly good. Ian Crawford took an awful lot of photographs. Many of them were slides, the rest were black and white. I've already mentioned his problems about the preservation of his slides, and from the Udal North, the vast majority of all photographic imagery has been lost. I believe there were about 1,700 images, of which we have only 400 slides of various qualities remaining, and only 57 black and white prints. I don't know what's happened, except there is a little bit of story from Andrew Selkirk, who established the Current Archaeology magazine. And he decided to do a story on the Udal, and he visited Ian Crawford at home. And Andrew Selkirk must have been looking round and said to him, well, why do you have your glass slides sat on top of a hot electric heater? All those images were destroyed. And I can just imagine Ian Crawford's reaction when he realised that his images were no longer there. Now, these two images, both of the Udal North, show that sometimes the camera wasn't focused correctly. And this image particularly, there's a lot of deterioration of quality. It also shows the person in the red shirt is actually Ian Crawford. But to me, it's all a little bit haphazard. I don't know what these images show. I can see that the problems with blown sand and the windbreaks were put up to prevent that. But it's very difficult making sense of all that we see in these pictures. I'll just bring the Udal North to a close by showing you some of the better artifacts. We'll have a lovely bone or antler comb, a fabulous ceramic or pottery vessel, actually remarkably reconstructed, bone pin, an iron projectile, which is amazing that it survived very well in the conditions on site, and a silver coin which has been dated, and I'm sorry, I don't know the date of it. There's a huge number of artifacts from this site. Most of them are bone, most of them are pottery, small sherds of pottery followed by bone. So they form the vast bulk of the assemblage from this site. There's a small amount of metalwork and stone, and I think that's about it. And the pottery and the bone have already been studied by other researchers. My final slide. I wanted to come back to the Udal North and show it to you again, but from a different angle, because it tells me that even though we know there's been archaeology on this site, there may be more, we don't know. But there are threats, modern threats to the viability of some of these mounds, some of the structures that I've perhaps shown you. It's a delicate environment. It's not protected. It's a moving environment. And, you know, we have to take care of it in some way. And this slide of David's does show that even within a year or two, things can change quite dramatically on site. We've also got wind erosion, we've got rising sea levels, and that's why it's important really to explore the archaeological story of this area, try as much out of it as possible. So it's not just about our past history, but it's, you know, it does bring everything right up to date with looking at the effects of climate change, for example, in the past, and how that affected the future. So I hope I've been able to show you the rough potential of these larger sites, what we can and what I think we can't do, and we'll take it from there. So finally, as I do know that some of you tonight have actually worked on the Udal and met Ian Crawford and worked with him, so if you have any information that you could share with me about your experiences working with him, I'd be very pleased to learn about. So I'm going to stop now, and hopefully you'll have some questions for me that I may be able to answer. And thank you very much for your patience.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you stop screen sharing now, thank you.
Right. There we go.
And yeah, so what's going to happen now is we'll have a reasonable length question and answer session. And if anybody would rather type in their questions rather than ask them personally, then please use the messaging part of the app. Thank you very much. So I've got a couple of questions for Beverley, but if anybody else has any, anyone else like to go first? Okay.
Everybody's got their microphones turned off, David.
Yeah, sorry, yes. You're going to ask a question, you're going to have to put your microphone back on, just remember that. Can I just ask, Could you just put the sort of date thing into context for me, because I got a bit confused about that. So the original work back in the 60s was really at the 4 smaller sites, RUX 1, 2, 3 and 6 down by the coast, and then the 2 main mound sites were done separately or concurrently at a different time. So could you just try and put that into a time context for us?
Well, actually, David, Ian Crawford started off on Udal North. He titivated on Udal South, and at the same time was looking at the smaller sites as well. And then he'd concentrate on Udal North for a few years. He continued to dabble on the smaller sites and then finished with those, and then immediately turned to the Udal South and was running the larger mounds together, and then he'd concentrate on the Udal South, leave and Udal North, and then all of a sudden there was a massive coastal erosion event that produced RUX 6, but he hadn't finished either of the other sites, and so he continued with them afterwards. So it was a little bit mixed up according to how I would see things. But it didn't just concentrate on one site.
Okay, so I understand that now. So basically, it wasn't done in any kind of order. So then, as a complete non-archaeologist, but just someone interested, I mean, obviously he had quite a lot of funding to support all this work. I'm sure the volunteers didn't get paid, presumably, but there must have been some kind of annual funding, and for that, he had to produce his annual reports. So how was it when it was kind of clear that things weren't maybe possibly going quite to plan, that they just kept funding him? Was it just his charisma just kept persuading them to continue funding it?
I think his charisma had a lot to do with it. He got money from his college in Cambridge, and also from what we would probably call small charities that funded him throughout his project. He often said that he put a lot of money in himself. And the volunteers, no, they didn't get paid. They got accommodation and food. But if anybody is here who was on the site, perhaps they could tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, does anyone else got a question, or Anne, has anything coming on the messaging board? Okay. Any other questions, anybody? Surely somebody must have a question. I mean, it is a lot to take in, that's definite, because I hadn't realised until I was looking through your slides the other day just how complex the North site was with all these different layers. And it's difficult to see when you go there today, whether just is basically this hole and these little areas of stones down the bottom, which may have just sort of rolled in there. You've got no sense that there's any kind of structure there. But he got through so much when he was excavating there.
Yeah, it was interesting comparing your modern views of the sites with the excavation photographs, which seem to make the site so much bigger than what seems to be currently visible. So whether there's been a lot of slippage of the sand and the area has got smaller over time, I'm not sure. But I wonder how all that could fit into the Udal North, this very complex story, which, you know, of buildings. I'm just not sure how it all fitted together at the moment.
Okay. And are there any, I know you're always very coy about this, but are there any, and I think there was some talk 2 or 3 years ago that there wasn't really going to be any more work done on this, but you seem to imply this evening that there possibly was going to be some more work done. Is that correct?
But as I, yeah, I said, if you started small and understood how Ian Crawford worked, you can work with this. I have every intention of writing up the small sites next, because there's been quite a lot of work done on them. It's just we're dealing with something that's in imperial measurements, stuff that needs to be scanned into digital format, and then, you know, it'd be easy enough to get those published. And then, as I mentioned as I was talking, that the Udal South, although very similar in the way it, you know, was firstly in imperial and then switched to metric, it's doable. But I've always been hesitant about the Udal North, because I'm not convinced that Ian Crawford knew what he was doing at that point. And it wasn't easy for him to understand what he was actually finding.
Okay. So anyone else got any more questions? Don't forget, you need to unmute yourself if you have a question. Anyone?
Can I just ask one very quick one, please? It's Neil Cameron, Cambria. The artifacts that you've talked about, can you tell us where they are, where they're stored nowadays, and whether it is possible to see them at all?
Well, yes. The RUX6 material is all up with you. I think it's in the museum at Benbecula, and it has been on, a lot of it has been on display several times in the last 10 years. The remaining bulk of artifacts are in storage, in secure storage, but not on the island.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Any questions? Again, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can I ask a question, David?
Yeah.
Or Beverley. Was there any evidence of layers above the the round houses on the south mound, or was it straight onto the iron houses? It seems odd that one mound is full of Viking and medieval stuff with nothing in between and not gone deeper, whilst the other one is just pure Iron Age.
Yeah, no, that was a question I was considering myself. There's no record of anything above the wheelhouses, no record at all. It looks as if, you know, there had been a massive accumulation of sand, and they weren't used again for any habitation. And that might be, well, there might have been more recent kelp drying dikes or something like that, but there was nothing medieval or later. Does that answer?
Yeah, it just seems slightly odd.
Yes, I know, but it may be more to do with the sand than anything else.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah. I see that somebody's
Got a
asked.
question from Martin. Yes.
Yes, my question.
Can you see that, Beverley?
Yeah. No, yes. The wheelhouses have not been reconstructed at all. They are as they are. If you go to the site, you will recognise them, and they were never taken apart. I know in my own work as an archaeologist, I've been more in the guise of a demolition expert, and had I been working on that, on the wheelhouse site, I would have liked to have known what was underneath. And my inclination was, okay, we've got the wheelhouse now. It's let's find out what's underneath by taking it apart. And Ian Crawford didn't do that. So you have part of the Udal legacy actually present and preserved as it was, which is perhaps not a bad thing.
Okay, anybody else have a question? I'd be really interested if anyone's got any anecdotes having worked there. Does anyone from UCAG ever worked there? No? Okay, that's interesting. And you relate us your story about when you went to see Ian at the site in the 90s. Tell us that story. That's quite good.
Yes, well, I took a group of friends to visit Ian, and we were staying with Neil Johnson at the bunkhouse in Lochmaddy. And Neil had organised for us to go out and see Ian, and he had agreed. He said he didn't really like showing people around the sites. I remember looking at the wheelhouses, but I don't remember anything about any of the other sites. He'd agreed that we could go and have a tour if we paid him a certain amount of money. And I seem to remember him stating how much money he wanted. And so we went out there in Neil's Land Rover. I don't think Neil's here tonight, but he would be able to probably tell the story better than me. And when we arrived at the tent where Ian was, Neil sort of said to me, come on, we need to go in first and I'll introduce you to Ian. So we went in, and then out came the whiskey and some glasses, and it was, oh, have a dram. So I kind of looked at Neil, and Neil was going, you need to have a dram here. So we're dramming there at about 10:30 in the morning, and I'd left, the others were all sitting in Neil's Land Rover kind of waiting for all the action. And eventually we sort of emerged from Ian's tent, and he took us off and showed us around the site. I think it was quite a wild day, but you know, he gave us a tour, and I handed over all this money. I think he was quite happy. It was a bit bizarre, but yeah.
I think you got off lightly. I gather other people with other archaeologists, shall I say, who tried to visit the site were told to go away. Just thinking about the drink, there was a tradition, I believe, on the site, and I have photographic evidence of this, that whoever found the best artifact, shall I say, that week, at the end of the day, received a dram of whiskey or whatever. And all the rest of the diggers were all waiting to go home while this one person received this drink. So for the rest of them, it wasn't a very nice thing. They're all tired and obviously wanting to get back and get cleaned up and fed.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Thanks for that, Anne. So any more questions from anybody, or shall we wind up there? Any last questions? Any thoughts? Okay. My final thought before I hand over to Anne is that I think it's the fencing around the south side is definitely nearing the end of its life, is the way I put it.
Oh, right.
And it's a shame that there's actually no way in there. And I know we can take sort of accessibility too far these days, but I mean, you just have to climb the fence basically. There's no way through it. There might have been a stile there, I suppose, at one time, but that's long gone. And I think it would be good to have it, to ensure its protection, because by US standards, in those kind of conditions in the sand, it's actually relatively well preserved. And what would be great, of course, would be to have some interpretation there, or just to show, well, this is actually, I know some that's fallen down, some that's covered up now, but these are the main features, and I think it'd be really good to have it explained. I mean, for all its faults, it's still an important site, and I think it would be definitely beneficial to have it better accessible and better interpreted. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to hand over to Anne now to say finish off.
Beverley, thank you so much for giving your presentation this evening. I think it's given us a lot to think about, and I think personally I really enjoyed seeing some of Ian Crawford's sketches and photographs, things that I'd not seen before, and images of artifacts, and just interesting to know and understand the difficulties with the qualities of the photographs and the slides, and how frustrating and tricky it has been and is to work with the material that you do actually have. So you've done a tremendous amount of work already with the earlier site, and great again to be revisiting the wheelhouses. And I think, you know, we gems like Beveridge's Suturing that he had read about, and then obviously, well, it looked to me like he'd found it, but you know, why did the significance of it become lost? Why didn't he go back to that? They're really interesting questions, and I think it was great for you to be pointing these things out to us, for us to think about, particularly, you know, I know a lot of us go out there and look at the site quite often. So I think it's been a real eye-opener, and you know, I think you presented to us just how tricky it is to look at what you have and to decide, well, what can we actually work with, you know, to put a story together. So it's just been fascinating, and thank you so much. It's just been an excellent evening.
Oh, thank you very much, Anne. Thank you. And thank you, David, as well.
Not at all. And thank you from everybody else, I'm sure. I'm sure everyone's muted, but if we were there, we would give a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Oh, the hands are coming up. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much indeed for all the time you put into it, and we really appreciate it. So I'm going to end the recording there and end the session, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Thank you.